As you well know, Lebanon's economy is an open economy. Its banking system is highly dollarized. With the capital outflows that we witnessed starting back in 2015, the banking system's liquidity was gradually draining. This was a consequence of the Anti-Terrorism Act, which was passed in the United States in 2015. Since then, we had a number of events, the last being the Caesar Act. And so we had growing balance of payments deficits, which obviously will ultimately impact the valuation of the national currency. And in 2018, we had the Cedar Conference, which was organized by European countries, the World Bank, and other international donors, which required Lebanon to go through a reform program, an 18-point reform program. The government, up till today, we heard today the Prime Minister announcing that we should not tie the international funding with the reform program today. The government is effectively intent on ignoring these demands. There is one success only, and that is the passing of the anti-corruption law early this year, but it remains an academic exercise. In 2019, the outflows became intensified. The central bank should have applied restraining measures, if not capital controls, but it did not, unfortunately. And so the outflow of capital continued to impact the liquidity of banks. So post-October 17, with the popular movement, the Lebanese pound started to depreciate, and not to devalue. Its depreciation because it fell due to market forces. The deposits that come into the country are rented money. To change our traditions, and this is what we have started recently doing, and the central bank is supporting a number of initiatives. The most recent one was yesterday, which was to announce the inauguration of the Cedar Oxygen Fund, which is going to support the working capital of Lebanese industries by, this is an initiative taken by Lebanese living in diaspora. So we hope this will succeed, and this will ultimately help us reduce the trade gap and the drain on our foreign currency reserves. Well, we cannot blame expats. The problem of the banking system lies with the government decision back in March 9, when it decided to suspend and put a moratorium on the national debt repayment. And this is a huge problem because it means that it impacts the credibility of our whole financial system. So what the government needs to do is to sit down with its creditors, and it should do it before the beginning of September. We have only a month or so to conduct negotiations, since the government had suspended and not defaulted. So it's still not in default. So we have to capture this opportunity and start negotiations. But these negotiations hinge on a basic tenet, which is that whether the IMF the World Bank, all international agencies, even the French foreign minister recently, all the international community is asking Lebanon to start its implementable reform program. And we haven't seen that yet. Alternatively, what the government is doing is that it has prepared a plan which effectively wipes out some 75% of the total national debt. The national debt of Lebanon is 94 billion. So they're writing off in the plan some 70 billion. These are, this is the debt that is held by banking system and the central bank. So what they are effectively doing is to implement what the IMF mission negotiating with the government has suggested, and that is to bring down the debt to income to GDP ratio to 100%. But what they have done in their calculations was also to bring down the GDP from 54 billion to 24 billion. So this is why the tolerance for holding national debt would have to go down from 94 to 24. This is not going to work, and it's an absurd plan. And it is so because effectively what we are doing is that we are penalizing, ultimately who? We are penalizing the depositors who are holders of this debt, whether local or international. On the issue of restructuring of banks, which the government proposed in its plan. It proposed it based on what I discussed earlier, and that is we write off public debt, 75% of public debt, and effectively what we are doing, since banks hold substantial amounts of public debt, is that we are obliterating the whole banking system by doing so. And what the government is proposing as alternative to our current banking system is to have new established banks, a 5-bank system, which effectively would be transforming the change of our free, open economy into a closed, centrally planned economy. And thus the call for us to look east, which the government and its allies has been doing recently, mean we copy the economic model of North Korea. Now the central bank on July 19 took back the reins and formed a committee to study the restructuring of banks. This will take some time. Banks can handle and can manage their debt well, especially the private sector debt, with losses anticipated not to exceed 10 billion. They have the capital resources and the cushion to handle these, and these can be amortized over several years. But what the banking system cannot do is to handle $70 billion of public debt written off. And finally, if we are to have bank mergers and acquisitions, we have to apply the bank merger law of 1993, which the central bank implements by providing Lebanese pound loans, soft loans to the banks undergoing mergers and acquisitions. But unfortunately, the problem of these banks are not in Lebanese pounds, but in foreign currency. And therefore, we would need to inject capital. Where does this capital come from? Mainly from the shareholders' money, Also, we should expect Europe and European banks and probably American banks to participate. And if not, if we are to go east, it's not a bad idea, as long as banks, for example, in China, participate in recapitalizing the banking system in Lebanon. Let me give you an example from my experience. For 15 years ago, I chaired the anti-corruption committee of the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC Lebanon branch. And we, in that committee, we prepared a draft law to tackle corruption. And we presented this draft law, one president of the republic, then the other, then the third. And for 15 years, it went to parliamentary committees. And finally, it was, with the pressure applied by the international community, it was passed into law early this year. Can you imagine? It took 15 years to get this law passed. Another example is the electricity sector. The head of Siemens company came to Lebanon in July 2018 with a mission that accompanied Chancellor Angela Merkel. And they proposed an overhaul of our electricity sector based on gas-powered generators supplied by the Germans. They were turned down by our government. Before that, the World Bank had a similar plan for the electricity sector. And according to that plan, and we are talking about 5-6 years ago, the World Bank anticipated the total cost of the overhaul of our generators not to exceed 2.2, 2.3 billion. We have to spend on electricity subsidies about $2 billion, the equivalent of the cost of the overhaul of all our generators. More recently, the Jordanians offered to sell us electricity at 2.5 cents, and they offered to provide 250 megawatts. This is 10% of all our needs. At 2.5 cents, it's much cheaper than what we are paying currently. We pay 11, 12 cents to produce a kilowatt of electricity. The Jordanian Minister of Energy, Mrs. Hala Zawati, discussed this with our energy minister in the previous government, and then with the current government, and she asked them to sign an MOU. It took them some time, about a year, to sign the MOU. Will we be able to benefit from this offer? I asked the international agency, do we have transmission lines? And they said, yes, we do. Will the Americans veto this project? And they told me they will not veto it. So why haven't we proceeded with implementing it? The government has approved to conduct two types of audits of the central bank. One is the traditional accounts audit, and the other, they call it the forensic audit for suspicion of malpractice or corruption or what have you. Both audits compromise the central bank's independence. And this is a legal issue that has to be explored by the government before they proceed with these audits. The central bank, as is, conducts audits and oversight, multi-layered audits and oversight. We have to start with two joint auditors, Deloitte and Ernst & Young. We have an internal audit department. We have a government commissioner that has offices at the premises of the central bank with a team of officers, and any decision taken by the Central Council, which is the board of the central bank, has to be vetted by the government commission before it goes through. And then finally, we have, as members of the board, the Director General of the Ministry of Finance and the Director General of the Ministry of Economy. And the Central Council meetings cannot be convened unless one of these two general directors are present. So the transparency is there. Why are we wasting our time? Now, the problem that they are probably trying to resolve is why the central bank incurred these huge losses. The losses were due mainly to the decision of the government not to settle its obligations. But it also is due to the cost incurred by the central bank trying to raise funds to cover the $6 to $7 billion foreign currency requirements of the annual requirements of the government. And the reason for these exorbitant costs is that the credit rating of the country, the sovereign rating, is so low. We have reached now C rating, which means that as we go down in our rating, our cost of raising funds would go up. And the reason for the bad rating is that we have bad fiscal policy and a sovereign state coexisting with armed militias, according to the rating agencies. This is how they conceive the rating. Since you have these two issues, your rating will be low. And the outcome is that the rating of Lebanon penalizes the country and penalizes the investors because the cost of borrowing becomes so high. We have also not to forget that the economy bears the cost of wars in the region. The central bank estimated this cost at about $4 billion a year. And a similar sum is siphoned off through political extortion, nepotism, and outright corruption. Corruption, the politicians have not been shy to admit. They consider it tacit, and they consider it to be taken for granted under a political accord which saves pieces of the pie for each sect in Lebanon.